They were 18, or 19, or 20 years old. Sailors in a tropical paradise. They didn't know that on the other side of the ocean, another group of young men was preparing to strike them while they slept. Their paths would cross for a few short hours on a Sunday morning in December. And in one terrifying instant, more than 1,000 of them would die. The legacy of what happened on December the 7th, 1941, still haunts us today. In the first images from inside the USS Arizona, an underwater cemetery that's also an ecological time bomb. In the search for a top-secret Japanese submarine that was sunk about an hour before the attack began.
The submarine's heading north, starting to dive.
And in the quest to learn what really happened that day. And most of all, it still lives on in the memories of the men who were there when everything changed.
Just a young kid when this happened. And I've lived through it. I lost a lot of my friends.
I reached down to try to help him. I scared to get all came off.
But I hope it never happens again. Nobody will ever know what it was like, except somebody that was actually there.
They never had a chance. They didn't know what was coming. Nobody knew about it. They never woke up.
This is the story of a day when the history of the world took an unexpected turn at a sleepy little port in Hawaii called Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in the first summer of the new millennium. 60 years ago on this island, a battle was fought. Perhaps the most one-sided battle in American history. It plunged the United States into war, and in the space of little more than 2 hours, took the lives of 2,400 Americans. Ever since that day, Pearl Harbor has been a place of pilgrimage. Many of the men who lived through the attack have returned at least once to remember what happened and to pay their respects to friends who didn't make it.
We remember December 7th, 1941, when so many gave the last devotion of their efforts to this.
Well, it was kind of hard, yes, I'll admit it, because I couldn't do anything that the other guys could. I was only 5'3" and weighed 125 pounds. My battle station was a #2 loader on a 5-inch gun, and I couldn't even pick up the shells that had to be put in the gun.
How can this ever happen? One of the strongest navies in the world, and we're sitting here with our pants down. We got caught, period.
It was one of the best assignments in the Navy. A sailor joining the Pacific Fleet in Hawaii could expect warm air, lots of sunshine, and plenty of things to do on shore leave. In the Atlantic theater of war, things were different. Europe had been at war for more than 2 years. Hitler's soldiers occupied Paris. London was being blitzed by Nazi bombs. For sailors stationed in the Pacific, there was only one threat on the horizon. Yet most Americans knew next to nothing about the country or its people, who were thought to be short and nearsighted. Quaint little people ruled by an old-fashioned emperor. In reality, Japan was a modern military power that had signed a pact with Nazi Germany. Japanese troops brutally occupied parts of China and were poised to move against other neighbors. But the United States Pacific Fleet stood in the way, and early in 1941, the Japanese military decided to do something about that.
Why would Japan want to go to war with the United States? What Japan wanted was the oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. What they wanted was the tin and the rubber out of Malaya. They wanted the Philippines because of its strategic location. Nobody thought that they would ever come out to Pearl Harbor. That's how you achieve surprise in war. You attack where nobody expects it.
It was the brainchild of a 57-year-old Japanese admiral named Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto decided to strike the US fleet at its home base, at anchor in the cramped, shallow harbor near Honolulu.
For Yamamoto, he had studied in the United States. He had gone to Harvard. He knew what the Americans were like. And he said at one point, I don't care if we march troops down Pennsylvania Avenue, we're not going to conquer the United States. He planned the attack with the idea that if we're going to have any chance of winning this war, we've got to destroy the American fleet. And that'll give us 6 months to run wild in the Southwest Pacific. And we can build up a defensive barrier that will be very difficult for the Americans to crack. And at some point, they're going to say, we quit. You keep your gains.
In the spring of 1941, planning for the attack began in earnest, although only a handful of Japanese officers knew about it. A talented pilot named Minoru Genda was given the task of figuring out how to inflict maximum damage on the American fleet, especially its battleships and carriers, in a surprise attack from the air. Genda decided that a combination of bombs and torpedoes modified to operate in shallow waters would have the best chance of success. Late that summer and into the autumn, Japanese pilots trained for their top-secret mission. They rehearsed the low-altitude attack angles they would need over the harbor. They practiced strafing runs over and over. By the autumn, Yamamoto's plan had evolved into a mammoth undertaking that would require 6 aircraft carriers, more than 350 airplanes, and, almost as an afterthought, 5 midget submarines. Those 5 midget submarines played a curious and little-known part in the attack, and an expedition is getting underway in Honolulu to learn more. One of the tiny subs almost cost Japan the critical element of surprise.
And there's only 2 outliers. Target
And
32,
that's the one undersea explorer
16.
Robert Ballard is hoping to find.
To the east.
For the man who
And all
found
of
the
a sudden,
Titanic
he's
and the
attacked.
Bismarck, this search represents a
Right in
unique
this neck of the
challenge.
woods.
It's one of the smallest
The
ships
target's-
Ballard's ever looked for, and no one really knows where it sank.
How are you? Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. So, welcome aboard.
Joining him will be a man who was part of the
Gentlemen, we'll be
submarine
leaving
task
in a few
force
minutes.
6 decades ago,
And
Kichiji Dewa.
Right. And then we'll be going...
The midget submarine they'll be looking for was sunk by an American destroyer well before the attack started, and could have alerted the American forces, but did not.
Here, so, gentlemen, I'd like to introduce some colleagues here.
Good morning, sir.
Will Lehner and Russ Reitz were there when it happened.
Glad that we can be friends. Glad that we can be friends.
For Ballard, the expedition offers an opportunity to clear up a common misconception.
Well, I think most people think that the first shot was fired by the Japanese as they swooped over the Pali and descended on our sleeping fleet that Sunday morning. But in fact, the first shot was fired out here, and it was fired by a U.S. destroyer.
Not only was it the first shots fired by America in the war, it should have alerted us to that something was going on. I find it incredibly ironic that the attack and sinking of this Japanese submarine an hour before the planes arrived did not alert us. And I just find that to be amazing.
Ballard's tight schedule only allows him 2 weeks for the mission, sponsored by National Geographic. But the search area isn't too large, and he does have the right equipment. Now, all he needs is a little luck.
We got to get it out.
November 26, 1941. The Japanese armada slipped out of port and headed east through wintry seas. 6 carriers were grouped at the center of the formation, surrounded by a protective ring of cruisers, battleships, and destroyers, some 30 ships in all. Because the success of the mission rested on taking the Americans totally by surprise, their route would take them well north of commercial shipping lanes. If another ship spotted them, the mission would be in jeopardy and possibly called off. Strict radio silence was maintained at all times as the attack force moved into position, while far to the south, 5 Japanese submarines were already closing in on the island of Oahu. Each mother sub, as it was called, carried 1 midget submarine lashed to its afterdeck. Together, they made up the most controversial element of the strike force.
The Japanese wanted to put everything that they had into this attack, and they had midget submarines. And so let's use them, was Yamamoto's decision. Now, there were people in the Japanese high command that objected strongly to that. Don't bring submarines into Pearl Harbor. In the first place, they're not going to get in. In the second place, they're not going to do much damage if they do. And in the third place, and by far more important, that's going to tip off the Americans that an attack is coming. And it's going to put the Americans up in general quarters all across Pearl Harbor and all across Hawaii. So don't use them.
But they did use them. Each midget sub would carry a 2-man crew into battle, 10 hand-picked, highly trained young men who were prepared to die for their country. On the night before the attack, they would penetrate Pearl Harbor, wait on the bottom for the planes to strike, then fire their 2 torpedoes at any large ship in their range. If circumstances permitted, they would try to leave the harbor and rendezvous with the mother subs. But no one really expected the submariners to return.
They were young, they were enthusiastic, they were courageous, they were ready to go out and die for the Emperor, and it was a suicide mission. Nobody said that quite that way, but that's what it was, a suicide mission. And these guys were eager for it.
当時の我々の気持ちとしてはですね、悲壮な感じいうのはありませんね。
There was no sense of impending tragedy. Everyone felt that we were simply carrying out our duty by taking part in military action, though I felt that they might never make it back.
Day one of the search, about 2 miles outside the narrow channel that leads into Pearl Harbor. It was here, somewhere, that a destroyer called the USS Ward was patrolling in the early hours of December the 7th, 1941.
I was thinking that we were a little more that way, but Russ says no, we were more this way.
Yeah.
But we were.
Well, then you average those two, right?
It's the history that tells you what you need to know. And so you have to steep yourself in history, and you have to read all sorts of sources, because a lot of history is conflicting. One book will say one thing, one book will say another thing, and so you have to find out, well, what do we all agree upon, and where is the uncertainty? Here the uncertainty was, where were they exactly when the attack took place?
Coming in from another direction. And all of the historical databases. Well, you know, after the war, and in fact during the war, this became a dumping site. And our biggest fear is that they dump something right on top of what we're looking for. So basically what you have down here is a museum of World War II. We don't know what the currents are going to be like. We don't know what the visibility is going to be like. We don't know how the ships can perform. So today is a big learning curve. Day one of our expedition.
Ballard decides the work will go faster if he adds another machine to the mix, a remotely operated vehicle called Little Herc.
Well, it's imaging ROV. It moves very rapidly. We can cover a lot of ground quick and see a lot of targets quick. So it's just a good way to go.
Little Herc is tethered behind a bulkier imaging system called Argus, and the two vehicles descend to 600 feet. In the control room, the team gets its first glimpse of the sea floor.
There's what's this coming up? The cylinder. Is that a torpedo? No. Piece of pipe.
This is really exciting. Every little thing looks like part of it.
Well, it looks like these are depth charges. There's a whole bunch of them. There's another one.
As the first few days of the search come to an end, they've seen a lot of debris and not much else. Saturday night, December the 6th, 1941. Sailors on shore leave filled the bars on Hotel Street in Honolulu. The usual Saturday night crowd gathered for dinner and dancing. At Hickam Field, the airplanes were parked wingtip to wingtip. And in the harbor, the warships of the Pacific Fleet prepared for the night. California, Oklahoma, Maryland, Tennessee, West Virginia, Arizona, Nevada. The last day of peace in the United States was coming to an end. December the 7th, 1941, a few minutes after midnight. 10 miles away from the mouth of Pearl Harbor, the 5 mother submarines prepared to launch the midgets. The Japanese crews could see the lights on Waikiki and make out strains of jazz when the wind shifted. Each of the submariners wrote a letter to his parents. Sadamu Kamida was a quiet mountain boy who loved baseball.
Forgive this negligent son for not writing these long months. We are soon to be dispatched to regions unknown. Should anything happen to me, do not grieve or mourn. Should I fail to write, do not be alarmed, for it means I am well and discharging my duties faithfully. Goodbye. The night before they left, Commander Yokoyama, his crewman Kamida, and I went to the officers' mess that normally enlisted men couldn't enter. We ate a farewell dinner. Later, there was a small party in the officers' wardroom.
Dewa watched his friends enter the midget sub and spoke to Yokoyama one last time over a phone link.
I said something like, "Take care to them." I didn't say anything special, just words of parting said on the phone, very normal. Even though the fact that they wouldn't return was a foregone conclusion, we didn't talk about it.
The midget carried by Dewa's submarine was the first to leave, released into the water around 1 a.m. By 3 a.m., all the midgets were making their way toward the harbor, except the one skippered by Ensign Sakamaki. He was having trouble with his gyroscope. Without it, he'd have to take his bearings on the surface and risk being spotted by an American ship.
You're sneaking into a harbor and you don't want to trip the alarm and let the Americans know that the war has begun. And so you must be extremely nervous. You've got to be just on pins and needles.
And then, the first missed opportunity for the Americans. At 3:42 a.m., an officer on board the minesweeper Condor spotted a periscope in the water 50 yards off the port bow. Condor alerted the Ward, patrolling the approaches to Pearl Harbor.
Remember about 3:30 or so, the skipper called general quarters, about 3:20, 3:30, I don't remember the exact time, but remember that?
I remember that.
And we thought, what kind of a skipper is this? He just came aboard, and now we got general quarters, and he's going to start drilling us. And we thought, remember, we thought
it was just a drill.
That skipper is going to be a tough one to live with. Yes, but he was one of the best skippers we ever had, remember?
But the Ward's new skipper misunderstood the message and went to look in the wrong place. The one thing Japanese planners feared most had occurred. 4 hours before the attack, one of their ships had been spotted, and nothing happened. Sunday, December the 7th, around dawn. Aboard the 6 aircraft carriers, the pilots and planes of the first wave began to assemble. Yamamoto's plan called for 2 distinct waves of attack. The first to reach Honolulu about 8 a.m. The second to follow within the hour. It meant getting the right aircraft into the air at the right time. Each wave would take about 15 minutes to launch. The first to go were 43 Mitsubishi fighters armed with machine guns and cannon, the dreaded Zeros. Then 49 Nakajima bombers, Kates, each carrying a single 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb. 51 Aichi dive bombers were next to leave, the Vals. And finally, another 40 Kates carrying specially modified torpedoes. At about 6:20 a.m., the planes formed up and headed south. At almost the same time as the first wave turned toward Oahu, the US Navy got its second report of intruders near the harbor. At 6:30 a.m., a lookout on the freighter Antares spotted another submarine periscope, then a conning tower. Once again, the Ward raced to investigate. And this time, the destroyer found what she was looking for.
The submarine started to surface, and I'm midships right at the rail. And see, when I see this thing start to surface, I thought, wow, what's this?
Then the skipper took after this submarine. And of course, we didn't know it at the time, but later on, he told us that his first thought was ramming it. But he said, this is my first ship, and I don't want to ruin it.
And then all of a sudden, number 1 gun fired, and they missed because their elevation wasn't great enough, and we were that close. And then number 3 gun fired, and I saw the splash, the water line of the conning tower as the shell hit the conning tower.
It must have rang like a bell. I mean, just must have been an incredible explosion that went off right next to their head. I mean, remember that the skipper is standing in the conning tower and the shell hit the conning tower. You would think he must have died instantly. Or did he? Because they then began to dive, so clearly they weren't dead. And they then began to dive, and no sooner did they dive than the depth charges are going off.
Exploded, and I didn't see the submarine as it came up, but I'm told that it came up, rolled over, and then went back down again.
After the depth charges that we dropped, I can't see any way it could have gotten away from us.
At 6:51 a.m., Skipper William Outerbridge of the Ward radioed headquarters that he had seen and fired upon an unidentified submarine. He repeated the message 2 minutes later. At headquarters, the Ward's terse report slowly worked its way up the chain of command. For the second time that morning, the Japanese had tripped the alarm. And for the second time, nothing happened. Day 10 of Ballard's search, and still no sign of what they're looking for.
We were in here.
The submarine was coming this way, and we were coming this way.
Why was this one on the surface?
Maybe he's not sure, but maybe the passenger in the small submarine, they are looking and then they make sure the position.
So far, Ballard has covered about 2 square miles of seabed in an area called the Flats, where the Ward was patrolling. So far, they've seen a lot of debris, but the missing sub has eluded them. Each time they pick up a promising target on sonar, it turns out to be something else. A crumpled seaplane used by the Navy in the late 20s and 30s. A Grumman Hellcat fighter. Then, part of a similar type of midget sub, captured later in the war and then dumped. And finally, something that seems to have treads.
You think so? Yeah, it's a tank. The tracked vehicle. Well, let's work it over. Yeah, look.
Another day's search is coming to an end without results.
Exhausted all our targets.
Yep. There's nothing left to look at. All right, well, the only thing left is the base of the wall, and that the sub does, so let's call it a wrap and pull it up, okay? Out of the pool.
That's good.
flat, so
very good.
the only place left is up against the wall.
Yeah.
Yep.
So tomorrow we'll come out with the 2 subs and take it right in next to the channel and look at the base of the wall, which we couldn't do with these vehicles.
Good.
They've used up most of their allotted 2 weeks, with nothing to show for it. For Bob Ballard and his team, time is running out. December the 7th, 1941, 7 a.m. A mobile radar station on the northwest coast of Oahu picked up the signal of a massive number of aircraft approaching the island from the north. They were less than 140 miles away, moving at 180 miles an hour. A telephone call went immediately to the information center in Honolulu, 40 miles to the southeast. The call was routed to a private named MacDonald, who passed it on to a Lieutenant Tyler, who had just been assigned to the job. Tyler told the radar operators not to worry about it. In his mind, it was just a squadron of American B-17s due in from the mainland. For the 3rd time that day, the Japanese had tripped the alarm, and for the 3rd time, no one seemed to notice. It was 7:15 a.m. At 7:40 a.m., the first wave of airplanes reached the coast of Oahu, guided by the signal from a Honolulu radio station. The bombers and torpedo planes were at 9,000 feet. 5,000 feet above them, the Zeros flew cover. The first wave began to break up into their attack formations. One to fly inland towards Wheeler Airfield. The other to move down the western coast to Pearl Harbor. They were the only planes in the sky. There was no sign whatsoever that the Americans knew they were about to be attacked. At 7:50 a.m., the first wave reached Pearl Harbor. Among their first targets, Hickam Airfield and the Naval Air Base on Ford Island. Clarence Miner was an airman stationed on Ford Island.
After all that noise on the tin roof up there and stuff were popping around, I looked up and I saw this airplane come diving down and that big meatball, and I said, oh shit. And then all hell all over the place was breaking loose. Bombs dropping, machine gun fire. And like I said, the things are so darn low you can throw rocks at them.
Ralph Lindenmeyer was also on Ford Island.
7:55 in the morning, an explosion woke us up. I looked up at the clock when I first heard the explosion and felt it, and I said, the Japs are here. And when I looked out the window, the plane came over and it had saw the meatball on the fuselage and the wings, and I could look into the pilot's face and I could almost see him grinning.
Anchored on Pier 1010 was the utility vessel Argon, where 19-year-old Charles Christensen worked in the machine shop.
I thought, oh, that was a bad explosion. I wonder what happened. And I opened the porthole up, and I stuck my head right on out there, you know, and oh boy, was there ever a fire on Ford Island. I thought, oh my goodness, something is really bad blowing up over there.
It took a while for sailors in the ships at anchor to comprehend what was happening. Bert Davis, a machinist's mate on the USS Selfridge, thought it was some kind of readiness drill.
That's where I was standing when the plane came in. I was standing there shining my shoes. And I saw these planes coming in. Came right straight across where the Raleigh was. And I thought to myself, what in the hell is the Army doing holding maneuvers on a day like this?
While the dive bombers hammered the airfields, the torpedo planes descended to an altitude of a few dozen feet and took dead aim at Battleship Row. Aboard the Argonne, Charles Christensen had a perfect view of the first torpedo run.
He's coming in almost straight across me at a slight angle across, and he's low enough that he's maybe 30 feet off of the water, which puts him maybe eye level or a little more from me, and I can see the man's face. He's got his helmet on, he's got his goggles on, and he's looking over the side, and when he straightened that plane out, leveled it out, he dropped that torpedo, and I thought, oh my God, look at that. And that torpedo just went as straight for the Oklahoma as it could go.
This photo, taken from a Japanese plane, shows Battleship Row just after the attack began. The ripples emanating outward are the result of multiple torpedo strikes. George Smith was below deck on the battleship Oklahoma when General Quarters sounded.
Then all of a sudden the guy come over to the loudspeaker, this is no shit, move it. And then we got a torpedo. I was really so scared I didn't know what the hell was going on.
The Oklahoma started to capsize almost immediately.
When they said abandoned ship, the only way we could get out was through the Kingsville window. We went out there, and the ship was rolling on top of us. Maybe we jumped about 5 feet into the water, which wasn't far. But when you turn around and see this thing coming on top of you, you swim for all you can swim and as fast as you can swim. Because we know we had to get around the big gun turrets. They were coming over next on us.
It went over so fast, I just was sure, I didn't know, but I was sure they were trapped inside of that because it just rolled right on over, and there it was, keel up.
George Smith had just been released from the Oklahoma's brig for going ashore without leave, and it saved his life.
And when the ship got the torpedo, the brig was in the carpenter shop on board ship. And when the torpedo hit, it broke the carpenter's workbench loose, pinned the guard against the wall, the bulkhead, and he couldn't release the other men that were in the brig, and they all drowned.
On the far side of Ford Island, the old battleship Utah also got hit a few minutes before 8. Clark Simmons worked on the Utah as a mess attendant.
And as I looked out the port, I saw a plane making a run on the Utah. And as she dropped the torpedo, the wing dipped, and then he straightened up, and the torpedo hit it, and another one right behind it did the same thing. And we knew that it was just a matter of time before the ship was going to sink. And actually it took 8 minutes. In 8 minutes, the ship was history. She had turned turtle in 8 minutes. As the lines began to part, came over the side and began to swim toward Fort Island. And as we were swimming, they were machine gunning us from both directions, from this direction, and when they came from Pearl City over here, from that direction also. I saw fellas yelling and screaming. Some of the fellas in the water was asking for help. It was so chaotic. I really didn't know what was going on.
But the biggest blow was yet to come. Lying inboard of the repair ship Vestal was the battleship Arizona. High overhead, a Kate released an armor-piercing bomb that drifted down towards the Arizona's No. 2 gun turret. It was 10 minutes after 8. A film camera captured the moment of impact. In that instant, more than 1,000 crewmen died. Stu Headley was on the West Virginia, a few hundred feet away.
One gigantic explosion. Now, when we fired the 16-inch, you're inside, it sounds like thunder up in the distance. But this didn't sound like no thunder. This was one gigantic explosion. The stern of our ship lifted out of the water, but at the same time we were getting hit with torpedoes, we were starting to list. But we saw about 32 men flying through the air from the Arizona.
Oil from the fully fueled Arizona began to spread and catch fire. The heat was so intense, even sailors on nearby ships were threatened.
So Crossan and I stripped right down to our undershorts and jumped in and swam underwater. Now, we're not underwater swimmers, but we swam underwater that day because that was the hottest breath of air we ever breathed, because that was the oil from the Arizona that was ablaze.
The bomb had penetrated Arizona's forward magazine and ignited more than 1 million pounds of gunpowder. Those who were still alive found themselves in an inferno.
They were in this oil that was on fire. They were trying to swim out of it. They'd come up and trying to get their breath. Their eyes, the white of their eyes was just as red as they can be. I can just see it today. The skin on their face was just falling off. And on top of that, all of this oil, and they were just drenched in oil.
Bert Davis went out in a whaleboat to pick up survivors.
Oh, God, it was horrible. Just one fella started to reach up to try to get a hold of the gunnel on the boat from the outside, and I reached down to try to help him, and I took him by the arm, and as I tried to lift like that, the skin all came off. He was dead by the time we got him in.
35 minutes after the attack began, the first wave flew away, leaving behind more than 1,000 dead American sailors, many of them teenagers, caught below decks when Arizona exploded and sank. Six decades after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Arizona still lies where she sank with her cargo of sailors. Most of their bodies have never been recovered. Her superstructure was removed during the war. Only the mount of her No. 3 turret remains above water. The Arizona was built nearly a century ago, and she spent more than half that time underwater. The National Park Service, which is responsible for maintaining the memorial, periodically checks on her condition. her passageways and hatches, her 14-inch guns. The interior of the ship is too dangerous for divers, so it's never been investigated by the Park Service, until now. With the help of a tiny ROV made available by National Geographic, workers will get their first glimpse of Arizona's condition deep inside the ship since about the time she went down. The initial survey reveals that the corrosion is worse than expected. And that may portend an ecological disaster because of something happening deep inside the ship. The Arizona has been leaking an estimated 2 pints of oil a day ever since she sank. But the Park Service is worried that the remaining fuel tanks, the ship's bunkers, could rupture at any moment.
Current estimates are that there's approximately 500,000 gallons, possibly in the bunkers on the aft section of the ship. And so with current technology, can we get to those bunkers? And what's happening with the metal on the hull and the internal portions of the ship? And so that's what we're trying to do, is find out, is there a way that we can contain that oil?
Today, the oil has begun to leak from more places than ever. To understand the extent of the threat to Pearl Harbor, the Park Service is conducting a detailed survey of the Arizona. Dan Lenihan is a Park Service diver and archaeologist.
If it's all released at once, it will probably be a major problem.
For the Park Service, the challenge is to avert a final catastrophe, an oil spill in the middle of Pearl Harbor.
There's no excuse for having this happen here. There's no excuse for not knowing enough about this ship that it would go to the point that we would have a travesty like that on our hands. We need to get ahead of it, need to find out what's happening.
The problem is complicated by the ship's designation as a grave site and by the oil's symbolic meaning.
Many visitors and survivors consider the oil to either be the tears of the ship or the ship is bleeding. We'll also be dealing with that emotional feelings that people have about the oil and the significance. It'll be a balance between what protecting the ecosystem is all about and protecting the tomb, the shrine that this place symbolizes.
Joining the Park Service on its survey is National Geographic underwater photographer David Duboulay. Even though parts of the Arizona were salvaged and the rest is slowly corroding, it is still impressive close up.
These huge naval rifles, they could fire something that weighed almost the weight of a Volkswagen 20 miles away. The Arizona, in fact, every battleship was built around these main armaments.
We gotta find number 31. There's a clothesman that says 31.
Hidden in the oily murk of Pearl Harbor, gun turret number 1 was forgotten for 40 years. Now, Duboulay is trying to document its massive guns for National Geographic magazine.
Almost every problem that I had related to visibility. One footfall, a fin stroke, would kick up this very, very, very soft mud. And the clouds would just billow out of the bottom, and the visibility would drop instantly from my wonderful 7 feet or 5 feet down to nothing.
The guns are as long as a bus, and bringing enough light down here to photograph them is an arduous operation. Duboulay needs a crew of 6 people to bring this submerged shrine to life. His moody images recall the ghostly legacy of the Arizona.
I think I got the shot. There's a shot of the 3 main guns of turret number 1, and they come out of the gloom like 3 fingers. And I'm looking up at them with a green background in the background. It's very gloomy. It's very dark. And Dan Linehan from the Park Service is down looking and examining the central barrel of the guns. It's a very gloomy, secret picture of the Arizona.
To its survivors, the Arizona is much more than a sunken ship.
This national park is probably the only one that has the intense emotional reaction that this one does to all visitors. And the survivors have taught me that. I mean, the survivors have really shown me what it is to be an American. And I'm probably the strongest American you'd find now after having worked here for 5 years. I think this place can really teach what the price of war is and what the price of freedom is.
Inside the memorial, a wall lists the 1,177 servicemen who died on the battleship. Every returning survivor knew someone who died on December the 7th.
Old Swede up there. Smith, Randolph Smith, he got machine gun.
They never had a chance. They didn't know what was coming. Nobody knew about it. They never woke up.
Aloha. Aloha.
Oh, I was going to ask you for a big hug, but I couldn't get one anyway.
Big hug.
I thought maybe,
Big hug. Let me give this lady a hug.
I thought maybe that you wouldn't want to hug an ugly old man.
Oh, I do. I do want it.
Carl Carson was a 20-year-old sailor on the Arizona the day she went down. He decided to come back to Pearl Harbor when doctors told him he didn't have much longer to live.
Be able to come back. Well, I lost a lot of good, dear friends over there. It's just awful hard to even think about it. I almost lost my own life. I hope I can make it over there all right. Get there. Yeah, okay. I need a little support.
Carl has never talked very much about what happened to him that day. Now, at last, it's time.
This is where I came out of, turret 3. Right. Came back on this. There used to be ladders up and down the thing, and I came out the turret and went down on. Well, I was out on deck doing the morning chores. All of a sudden, there's a plane come along, and didn't pay much attention to it because planes were landing at Ford Island all the time. And all of a sudden, the chips started flying all around me, and there was a plane that was strafing me. And somebody hollered, "It's the damn Japs, get under cover." Bomb went off. I learned later it was back by turret number 4, about where I'd been working about 10, 15 minutes before. And evidently it knocked me out, ruptured both my lungs, and I got smoke inhalation, and all the lights went out. I don't know how long I laid there, but when I woke up, there was no panic down there or anything, but there was smoke and water knee-deep. I run into a friend of mine that he was crying and asking me for help, and I looked at him in horror. And the skin on his face and his arms and everything was just hanging off like a mask or something. And I took a hold of his arm. Skin all came off from my hand. And there was nothing in this world I could do for that boy. And that has bothered me all of my life. Well, they gave the word to abandon ship. And we just practically stepped off of the quarterdeck into the water, and I guess I must have passed out. And went down in the water, and everything was just as peaceful and nice that it would have been so easy to just let go. And I saw this bright light, and something made me come to, and so I got back up the surface of the water, and oil all around, had water and oil in my teeth and down my throat and everything. It tasted horrible. I still taste it today. The oil was afire all around. The man saw me down there, and the fire was approaching me. It wasn't about 2 feet from me. And he reached down and pulled me up out of the water, and that man saved my life.
Bob Ballard has spent the entire mission searching the flats outside the harbor, without finding any sign of the lost midget son.
This is a mile. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to drop you down here at the base. At the base, or comfortably out.
Now he's turning his attention to the steep coral escarpment running roughly parallel to the shore, an area he calls the Wall.
In an expedition like this, you have to put your mind in the mind of the commander of the submarine, because his actions are going to define the size of the search area. What he does at that moment is going to tell you how big a search area you have to have. Clearly, if he was killed outright, then you didn't have to put yourself in his mind at all, because he's dead, and he's going to be right where they say he sank. But if he's still alive, he's going to then take certain evasive actions, and you have to then say, well, if I were that person, what would I do? And there were two options he had. One was to continue forward into Pearl Harbor, or the other was to turn and run for the high seas.
If the midget made a run for the high seas and sank farther out, there's no hope of finding it in the remaining time. But if it had continued toward the harbor, Ballard's team might stand a chance, with the help of their own miniature submersible.
All the hardware's on the other side, Mark. All righty, it's all yours. Well, I'll be talking to you over at the ring. Nice dive. Yeah, I'll be talking to you. Good luck. Head north. Turn left.
The one disadvantage of using a submersible is that Ballard's team won't be able to see what the sub-pilot is seeing during the dive. They'll have to rely on his descriptions over the radio and look at a videotape later.
We've landed the sub. It's going to land about 200 meters of water, head due north. As you can see, the airport's right there, so it's going to run into something, and it's going to run into a wall. And then it's going to head west along that wall, because if the submarine hit against that wall, it's going to fall down to the base. So we're going to spend the day exploring the base of this steep scarp that leads right up the channel into Pearl Harbor.
To me, deep workers look like sort of manned robots. They've got a human inside of them, but they have this big, this exoskeleton. But what they do is they permit a person to be highly maneuverable. They can spin on their axis, and they can go into very dangerous places because they're so small.
That makes sense. Yeah, he's moving over to your port. Looks like that 85 over there.
In the control room, all anyone can do is listen to the squawk box.
Yeah, Mark, give us maybe like 15. I want to try to really nail this tree perfectly.
They just reported finding a pile of batteries, and this submarine was a lot of batteries. So, starting to look like, smell like, but we're not sure.
Then the sub-pilot spots a torpedo.
Did he say? Right, where it should get interesting, and it is getting interesting. He's picked up a torpedo and debris, right in the area where we'd expect the submarine to impact it with the wall.
Ballard feels they are getting close, but they can't be sure of anything until they retrieve the deep worker and take a look at the videotape. December the 7th, 8:35 a.m., and the beginning of a brief 20-minute lull in the action. At airfields all over the island, crews scrambled to clear the runway so American planes could get in the air. Anti-aircraft guns were made ready. Field hospitals were set up to take care of the wounded, many of them burn victims. The first stories of individual acts of heroism began to make the rounds. One of them was about a mess attendant on the West Virginia named Dory Miller. Miller had carried the wounded captain of his ship to safety, then taken up a machine gun and shot down at least 2 Japanese planes. What made the story remarkable is that Dory Miller had never handled a machine gun, much less trained on one, because he was black, and like all African Americans in the 1941 Navy, restricted to the lowest ranking jobs. "14 men received America's highest military award, the Medal of Honor, for their heroism at Pearl Harbor, but Dory Miller wasn't one of them. He got the Navy Cross instead.
And the only reason why he didn't get the Congressional Medal, because he was black. You know, and the Navy being what it was at that time, you only could be a servant to the officers.
He never gave any thought for his life or anything. He grabbed a machine gun and he just started blasting away over the side of the ship. What he did was courageous, and many of us thought that man should have been given the Congressional Medal of Honor.
2 years after Pearl Harbor, Dory Miller died when his ship went down, torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. Pearl Harbor, 8:55 a.m. The seas were still boiling with smoke and flame when the second wave of the Japanese attack struck the island. This time, 167 aircraft split into 2 main groups. One headed inland. The other hugged the eastern coast and continued south to Pearl Harbor. But this time, the Americans fought back. The smoke in the harbor was now so thick that Japanese pilots had trouble seeing their targets. One of their targets was the battleship Nevada, with a hole in her side steaming toward the channel. Dive bombers honed in on the crippled giant. If they could sink the battleship now, it might block the channel and trap the fleet in the harbor.
With all of these planes coming in, when the Nevada got underway, the planes come in, dive bombing that. It looked like bees coming back to the hive. There were so many of them in there at one time that it was amazing that they didn't collide.
With bombs falling all around, Nevada's commander was able to run his ship aground on Hospital Point, which kept her from sinking and left the channel clear. By 10 o'clock, it was over. The second wave of attackers headed back to their carriers, leaving behind a shattered Pacific fleet.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation.
On the mainland, Americans were stunned by the news they were hearing from Pearl Harbor.
Every American alive over 65 years of age can remember exactly where they were and what they were doing when they got the news. It was a unifying event. It brought us together. Nothing else could have done it in that way.
And dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th,
President Roosevelt addressed the Congress the following day.
A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
And by December the 11th, the United States was at war with Germany and Japan, plunging it into a conflict that would forever change its place in the world. Back at Pearl Harbor, one problem survivors faced was notifying people back home that they were okay.
The Navy told us that everybody send a postcard home to your parents, let them know everything's all right. Well, I got one of the last postcards out of there, and I sent it home on December the 9th, is actually when I sent it home. And my mother didn't get that postcard until February, the first week of February sometime. I don't know why it took so long, but that's what it did. She didn't know if I was alive or dead. When the mailman got the card at the post office, he closed down the office and ran all the way to my house. He woke my mother and stepfather up at 6 o'clock in the morning and told them, "Your son's okay, here's a card." I still have that card. My mom, she couldn't believe it. I get emotional when I think about it, how she says she felt. I just don't know. It just turns me on.
Jack McCarran had been married to his high school sweetheart, Roberta, for 7 weeks when the attack came. It wasn't until Christmas Day that she found out what had happened to her husband, who was stationed on the Arizona.
The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you that your husband, John Harry McCarran, gunner's mate, 2nd, U.S. Navy, has been reported wounded in action in the performance of his duty and in the service of his country. This was received by me Christmas morning, 7 a.m., December 25th, 1941. Yuck. Yep, I hate to say this, but in my entire 81 years of living, that was the worst time in my entire life, was to have received this telegram, because I had no idea whether or not my husband of 49 days was alive or dead.
Lying in a hospital on Oahu, badly burned, Jack decided to spare his new wife the horror of seeing him again.
I said, tell Roberta to forget about me and go back to Saugus. So, you know, I've been burned, and I had, I didn't look like me. I guess my face and my hair was only like a, you know, shot.
on top of which it being Christmas. I was 3,000 miles away from my home, 3,000 miles away from my husband. I didn't know anybody.
I guess I never did write to you for,
No.
I didn't write to her for a long time.
The state of shock I was in was almost as bad as his.
Well, some time passed before I probably started coming out of it, and I was aboard ship, and you know, I loved this girl, and I realized that if I was going to survive, it would be with her.
My friends and shipmates took me over to the sick bay at Fort Island, and they laid me alongside the bulkhead over there, and I looked over, another shipmate laying across from me against the bulkhead, and he was holding his intestines in with his hand. And he looked up at me, and he said, war sure is hell in it, shipmate. And I said, yeah, it is. Well, lately I was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and I don't figure I have too many more years to live. And I thought that perhaps I might be a poor spokesman, so to speak, for my shipmates in telling my story so that they wouldn't be forgotten. And that's one and only reason that I came back. And I'm a kind of a private person. It's been hard to do, but I think it was time that it needed to be told. And I think it has been well worth it. I feel a lot better now.
It's the final day of the search, and Ballard has had his machines in the water for hours. But he's not hopeful about the outcome.
We're in the final throes of this expedition. I mean, today is the last day. We have 2 subs going in the water right now, but it doesn't look good because we've looked at all the high priority sites and we haven't found the midget submarine. We're now out in the very low priority areas, and that can go on forever because it's a big ocean. So I'd be very surprised if we succeeded today.
Deep Worker returns from its pass at the wall and is hoisted out of the water for the final time. With it is a videotape of the debris it encountered. The news isn't encouraging.
We have a possibility, but I personally am not overly optimistic.
A quick review of the videotape confirms Ballard's fears. On closer examination, what had looked to the sub-pilot like a pile of batteries turns out to be something else.
Looks like anti-aircraft gun clips. Or hack-hacks, or... Yeah. Know what it looks like to you?
And the torpedo the pilot spotted has had its warhead removed, so it can't be from the lost midget sub.
You reach a moment when you know you're not going to succeed. Because you've given it the best shot. You're going back over the same territory, seeing the same targets a second or third time. Well, we found a bunch of junk. We don't really have a definitive set of objects that says that the submarine broke up, but it could have. So, clearly the sub did not survive. And did the war play a role in its demise? And certainly it did. But how did it finally meet its end? Gloriously in battle in Pearl Harbor? Was it sunk by someone else later on? What was its final moments? And for now, we don't know what they were.
The mystery of what happened to the midget subs would have been even deeper had it not been for a surprise development on the morning of December the 8th, 1941. In the early morning hours, a small submarine washed ashore on Oahu's east coast. It was the one piloted by Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki, the sub with the gyroscope problems. Sakamaki also washed ashore, exhausted and delirious. He was captured before he could kill himself, and thus became America's first prisoner of war. Of the 10 submariners who set out before dawn on the 7th, Sakamaki was the only one who survived. Historians have generally labeled the submarine mission a failure, since only one midget that we know of entered the harbor and was sunk during the attack after firing 2 harmless torpedoes. But analysis of a photo taken from a Japanese airplane just as the battle began suggests something else. It shows Battleship Row already under attack, a few minutes after 8, and in the water just beyond, a shadowy shape that appears to be a small submarine, and the wake of a torpedo aimed directly at the West Virginia. While some historians remain skeptical, that analysis could explain a message that Dewa received on the night of the 7th, more than 12 hours after the attack. It came from his friend, Ensign Yokoyama. Successful surprise attack. Then silence. Yokoyama's sub never made the rendezvous, and neither did any of the others. For years, Dewa has wondered what happened to Yokoyama and all the others who didn't come back. All he knows is that somewhere in these waters they died, as they expected they would.
Of course I hoped they would return, but the commander told me, if I come back, I'll come back with a wolf, as we say in Japan, and put the mother sub in danger. So I don't think they plan to return, even if they had succeeded.
Before he set out on his mission, one of the submariners left behind a poem he'd written earlier that day.
As the cherry blossoms fall at the height of their glory, so too must I fall, that men may call me a flower of Yamato, though my bones lie scattered in the bleak wilderness of strange and distant lands.
On the last day of his visit, Dewa asks to see the Arizona Memorial to pay his respects to the Americans who died on December the 7th.
America and Japan must have had their reasons for starting a war, but after coming here and seeing the waves of the Pacific, I question why we had to go to war. Japan and the United States are brothers. Pacific peace is world peace. This trip has made me feel that together we must protect it.
Jack McCarran and Carl Carson are also there to remember their ship and their shipmates. Underwater, the National Geographic camera prowls through the empty ship. These are the first images of the officers' quarters, images from another era, frozen in time. A bathroom with its regulation soap dish. An officer's desk, its papers still arranged in their pigeonholes. A wash basin now filled with sand beneath a shaving mirror. For Jack McCarran, the pictures of his old ship are almost too painful to bear.
Over 40 years, I couldn't, if I was asked, I couldn't talk. I didn't talk about it, I didn't think about it. I had erased it from my mind. I didn't have any memories. I really didn't. I saw that barnacles on that doorknob and the light in the overhead. And the thoughts were, who was that officer down in there? Did he survive? At one time, that knob was real nice and shiny, and he turned on that light to read. I don't remember the ship as that.
The legacy lives on in a Navy ship called the USS Pearl Harbor. For survivors, a journey on this ship is a chance to see the advances that have taken place over the decades. And to participate in some things that never change. Wandering through the galley, Clark Simmons recalls his service in the segregated Navy of 1941.
There was only one duties open to you, and that was serving the officers. But I've been very impressed with the achievement of the black Americans aboard here, with the young ladies. Some of the leading petty officers aboard the ship are black Americans. I don't know the words to put it, how happy I am to see the things that they have done.
For veterans like Charles Christensen, this is a chance to pass on the legacy of the battle to a new generation of sailors.
I was getting ready to go ashore. Oh, I look at them. I see me when I was 18 when I joined. I was 19 when the attack went off. I see it in them. Oh, yeah.
I can't even imagine it. I mean, I can't imagine if I would panic or not. I can't imagine seeing my world turned upside down and my whole world on fire.
For 3 days after the attack, the Arizona continued to burn. The final totals from the surprise attack were staggering. More than 2,400 deaths and almost 1,200 wounded. 21 ships of the US Pacific Fleet had been sunk or damaged, including all 8 battleships. Over 300 airplanes had been put out of commission. Admiral Yamamoto had accomplished everything he set out to do, except destroy the American aircraft carriers. And in the fighting to come, that would prove to be a critical failure.
One of the best things that ever happened to the United States was our carriers were not involved in the attack. Yamamoto sank battleships, but the battleship was not the queen of the seas any longer. After that day, from now on, it's the aircraft carrier. And the attack on Pearl Harbor, for all of the losses of lives, which comes first, of course, and the losses of ships, they didn't sink any aircraft carriers. And that made what was already a very bad mistake on Japan's part even worse.
But perhaps the greatest miscalculation was how the defeat would affect the American fighting spirit. Instead of a crippling blow, it became a rallying cry.
The next morning, the fire was still burning, and there was a ship, some of them, and I'm not for sure that some of them that still had the flag flying from yesterday. And at 8 o'clock, guess what? These ships are sitting there in the mud. It's time to raise the flag, and there's the American flag flying. Everything is fine.
And then the Americans went to work. Every ship that had been hit except the Arizona, Utah, and Oklahoma was refloated, repaired, and put back into service. Many would take part in the battles yet to come: Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. And so would the men who survived that day.
I grew up in the Navy. I learned a lot. When I came out of the Navy, I was 6 foot even, weighed 200 pounds. I actually grew up. I learned to be, we say, a man.
When I walk as a Pearl Harbor survivor, especially when I have my uniform on, I walk very proud. I represent the country, and I will represent it to the day I die. And I will always be proud to be part of it.
Well, Pearl Harbor to me is like beginning a new life. I may be a certain age, but it seemed that I was reborn that day.
Pearl Harbor survivors are special. They have a feeling for each other and for their country. They have a comradeship that is not matched anywhere in the civilian world. The only people that I've ever met who have that kind of comradeship are foxhole buddies. These guys were in the foxholes together. It's not a feeling of we showed them. It's not a feeling of triumph. It's a feeling of we did it together. We were there. And that's what matters.
It's kind of a hallowed place, and it's very beautiful. I'm amazed that it's just beautiful. And I understand that there's millions of visitors every year that come by and pay respect to my shipmates. To lots of them, I know a lot of them, those are just names. But to me, they'll always be my shipmates.
I don't think we'll ever be done with Pearl Harbor. I think Pearl Harbor is like Gettysburg. It's like Appomattox. It's like Lincoln's assassination. It's like Yorktown and the surrender to General Washington. God help our country if it's ever forgotten.